And Valerie, maybe
There we are.
exactly. So Roger Ebbatson is known to many of us, I think, as a stalwart of the Tennyson Society, serving as its vice president, always present at its gatherings and its conferences. But he's also known to the wider world as the author of many books, including most recently Perception, Class, and Environment in the Works of Thomas Hardy, which was published just this past year. And he's also been vice president of the Hardy Society. Professor Ebbatson has written extensively on literature and landscape, as well as on Heidegger and Heidegger's importance to literary thought and theory. And I'm thinking particularly of the wonderfully named book, Heidegger's Bicycle from 2006. And you'll find some of his work on Tennyson in that book, Heidegger's Bicycle, as well as in other books of his, An Imaginary England from 2005, Landscape and Literature from 2013, Landscapes of Eternal Return, which is subtitled Tennyson to Hardy, 2016. Professor Ebbatson has taught at the University of Sokoto in Nigeria, the University of Worcester, Loughborough University, and I realize all of these institutions were chosen to test my pronunciation of British place names. So University of Worcester, Loughborough University, and most recently at Lancaster University, where he remains honorary visiting professor. And he will be speaking to us tonight on the subject of Tennyson's sea fantasies. So Professor Roger Ebbatson.
Thanks. Thanks, Eric. Can everyone hear me now? Sorry. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Is that okay? I'm getting I've got these slides, but Val is going to maneuver the slides, if that's okay for everybody.
Yeah, we can hear you fine, Roger. That's grand.
Now, okay. I'll start then. Could we go to slide number 2? Well, thanks. Thanks. This is a painting by Waterhouse, who was, which is appeared in about 1900, but entitled A Mermaid. But Waterhouse was a very avid reader of Tennyson, and we believe this painting was affected by his reading of the poem, so I'm going to discuss. During the Middle Ages, the Christian view of the mermaid was of a beautiful young woman, of course, with a fish tail, a quintessential image of seduction, combining the representation of a virgin with that of a soulless creature who's half human and half animal. Despite her sexual beauty, she remains, of course, always a virgin who seeks to bewitch mariners and sometimes sings seductively to them. Whilst the European depiction of mermaids focuses on their white skin, black mermaids, notably the ambiguously gendered Mami Wata, did feature prominently in African folklore. It's been remarked how Romantic and Victorian writers found at the coast both an image for liminality, being on the edge. And it was during this literary period, I think, that we find a greater obsession with depictions of the coast. If we could go to slide 4, Val, I want to just read part of the poem, The Merman. The 2 poems I'm going to discuss are very early, both published in 1830. I'm just going to read a short section of this. I would be a merman bold. I would sit and sing the whole of the day. I would fill the sea halls with a voice of power. but at night I would roam abroad and play with the mermaids in and out of the rocks, dressing their hair with the white sea flower, and holding them back by their flowing locks, I would kiss them off.
I think Roger's frozen. We'll just have
Sorry,
to.
yeah, Roger, I'm afraid you've frozen. I don't know if you can hear us now, but you were just
The
kissing
mermaid.
you were kissing the mermaids, and then you froze for about 30 seconds there.
Oh, sorry.
Could you go back and read the second stanza again for us?
Yeah, sure. Yes, holding them. I would kiss them often under the sea, and kiss them again till they kissed me, laughingly, laughingly. Then we would wander away, away, to the pale green sea groves straight and high, chasing each other merrily. Is that okay for you? And can we then go back to slide 3, Val? In the companion text, The Mermaid, the poet declares a counterbalancing feminine ambition as follows. I would be a mermaid fair. I would sing to myself the whole of the day. With a comb of pearl, I would comb my hair. And still as I combed, I would sing and say, who is it loves me? Who loves not me? A bit later in the poem, the speaker says, all the mermen under the sea would feel their immortality die in their hearts for love of me. So there's a disjunction in the text between human and mythical time, of course classically embodied long before in accounts of Ulysses' encounter with the sirens, an episode in which Adorno writes, the regions of time part, as do water, earth, and air. As a poet in these two texts, Tennyson meditates on the separation and loss entailed in emerging from the world of myth, a distinction from the mythical past, which can only occur within a sort of developed consciousness of time, which balances or privileges the future, but also limits that foregrounding of the future. By living in the purple twilight under the sea, quote, the protagonists here cancel time, so that, as Adorno says, what appears in a work is its inner time, and the explosion of appearance blasts through the continuity of the latter. So the merman and mermaid manifest themselves as what another critic calls a crystalline image in which past and present are entwined. In the reading of the Odyssey proposed by Adorno, Odysseus' act of binding himself to the ship's mast is a gesture of self-protection. The dread of losing the self is balanced by devoting his life to obedience. The Song of the Sirens is therefore an object of contemplation, which in a way becomes art. As we've noticed, the traditional image of the mermaid develops from the divine half-fish and the half-human figure, and from the concept of the siren. Linda Ostern, who's written very interestingly, says for centuries the siren has inhabited a luminal space between sea and sky, a solid manifestation of artifice and the human psyche. Hers remains the voice of desire. This voice, therefore, is in a luminal space between the animal world and the spiritual. Christianity, paradoxically, perpetuates mermaids, and as Christianity spread through Europe, new concepts of heaven and hell emerged, and churches became adorned with sculptures. By the 14th century, non-Christian mythologies were incorporated into church art, and the growth of seafaring meant that the ocean became a mythical and actual space. The figure of the mermaid thus emerges as a complex representation of physical pleasure, lust, and heresy. There are four sources of the Christian mermaid mythology: the fish-tailed creatures, which had been allegedly encountered during the Roman Empire. Secondly, mythical or poetic descriptions, for example, in Homer, Hesiod, and so on. Thirdly, Celtic and German legends of rusalkas. And lastly, supposed actual sightings by seafarers. And Lara Knight notes how belief in mermaids can hardly be established on a timeline, so the origins of a mermaid cannot be determined. They appear to remain intertwined with religion, even when religions change. Mermaids have beautiful voices, she says. They tempt sailors, drown sailors, and carry a comb and mirror. This mermaid symbolism persisted for at least 1,000 years, representing the dangers of temptation, and they appeared in church sculptures, as we've noticed. Originally, they possessed two tails, but following the Renaissance, only one. Columbus, for example, claimed to have seen 3 mermaids near Haiti in the late 15th century. 18th century naturalists gathered together various resources to examine what they considered fantastic. And the Royal Society of London set up a panel to investigate mermaids. They spoke of accounts of amphibious aquatic animals. And by the mid-18th century, some scientists did believe in the existence of these mer people. Tradition makes the ocean a remnant of a kind of primeval chaos which surrounds the land, so that invertebrates such as octopuses, clams, sea anemones appear to be like nothing known in the world on the land. It does become, the figure of the mermaid becomes a myth which represents the fecundity of the ocean and perhaps its identification with the female gender. If we could go to slide 5, Val, thanks. Whilst having a woman on board ship was almost never allowed, it was regarded as unlucky. Paradoxically, mermaids did often appear carved on the bows of ships, a feature alluded to in another Tennyson poems, next slide, The Voyage. Warm broke the breeze against the brow, dry sank the tackle, sang the sail. The lady's head upon the prow caught the shrill salt and sheared the gale. The quasi-monastic quality of marine life, in other words, all male crew, may have encouraged the hallucinatory manifestation of the mermaid. The mermaid is a sexual figure, and not, of course, the same way as an ordinary woman. She represents a kind of primeval sexuality. There would be a powerful revival of the mermaid with the birth of Romanticism. And as Linda Austin writes, the swirling shapes of desire take on the nebulous liquescence of water, particularly in 19th century visions. We go to the next slide. Well, in Goethe's poem, Der Fischer, 1780, she spoke to him, she sang to him. His fate became quite plain. Half drawn by her, he glided in and was not seen again. Two of the most notable manifestations of this encounter are Hoffmann's opera Undine, 1816, based on a previous novel, and of course Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid of 1836, which reflected Danish folk tales. The roots of the Victorian fascination with the fairies lies within, of course, Romanticism, as in Coleridge, Blake, Keats, and particularly Walter Scott's Letters on Demonology of 1830. The opera Undine tells how a water sprite attains a soul by marrying a Christian knight, and this theme the cultural value of fairy people was being widely debated. As the shift from a rural to urban economy intensified, folk tales became increasingly significant. By discovering such legends as that of the Cornish mermaid of Zena, there's a statue of her at Zena, who desired and married and lured back to sea the squire's son, folklorists began to create a dialogue with a vanishing past. Carol Silver writes, submerged, transformed to fit the era in which they play a role, these folklore figures keep their secret lives. And she goes on, whether they are sentimentalized or vulgarized or explained away, they survived mysteriously as a subversive force in the 19th century. In considering the phenomenon of the mermaid, we might wish to consider how the intrusion of the supernatural into the everyday often occurs along a border between wild and civilized, such as the bank of a river, shore of a lake, or indeed the ocean itself. It's a border between land and sea where we can hope to overcome the primal power of the mermaid's link to her element. The sea in this complex of ideas is a frontier, but also a divide between reality and what we might call an other world, creating a dialectic between life and death. Water figures as a womb and a grave. This pair of Tennyson poems signals a distance from the romantic ode. As Dwight Culler remarks of these texts, the ascent into imaginative experience is by means of dialogue, not monologue, leading from a real world of the parlour to an imaginative realm of the sea, a movement refracted, for example, in Matthew Arnold's poem, The Forsaken Merman. In his study of Tennyson's Eastern sources, Payden argues that the notions of sea folk are drawn first from the minstrelsy of the Scottish border by Scott, which includes Leyden's Merman, and the poet also used Croker's Fairy Legends of 1828. Other sources, I think, for Tennyson included Keatley's Fairy Mythology and A Natural History of Norway, which was in Dr. Tennyson's library at Somersby. Another possible source, which Linda has identified, is Walter Scott's novel The Pirate, in which, as she notes, features a group of maskers dressed up as mermen and mermaids. And significantly, the plot centers upon a troubled father and son relationship. Payden observes Tennyson's conception of the underwater world as a scene of timeless, amorous life derives from the Brothers Grimm. Mermaids were amorous, aggressive, and dangerous to young men. And Payden goes on, you cannot overstate the close connections in the 1820s between the Isles of the Blessed, fairies, sea fairies, nymphs, mermaids, and Arthurian romance. So these mermaid poems have been rather neglected critically, and where they are discussed, they're rather dismissed as youthful jeux d'esprit. Like another early poem, The Sea Fairies, which I've written about elsewhere, they can be considered as poetically self-reflexively exploring the marine, what he calls broad sea wolves, as embodiments of Ronald Barthes' contention that all images are polysemous. They imply, Barthes says, a floating chain of signifieds. with the Tennyson poems corresponding to what Roland Barthes calls an anchorage of all possible meanings. The merman, bold, who is visualized sitting alone under the sea, may thus represent the poet, confronted with the contradictory apparition of art itself. Adorno's approach to aesthetic beauty is illuminating here, considering the representation of such fantasy figures. In Adorno's reading, quote, artworks become appearances, and I go on, as the appearance of an other, when the accent falls on the unreality of their reality, then the artwork, he says, becomes something momentary and sudden. The artwork thus construed represents what Adorno calls the balance between vanishing and the preserved. The appearance of the mermaid, like that of the artwork, embodies what Adorno describes as a script that flashes up, vanishes, and cannot be read for its meaning. Okay. Tennyson's poems, I think, well, I argue here, bear out Adorno's statement. Artworks are images as apparition, as appearance. That is to say, quote, concentrated in appearance as something momentary. Tennyson's poems therefore validate what Adorno calls the affinity of artworks to the dream. And he goes on, in the artwork, nothing is literal. Spirit is their ether. The exclamation of the merman we would call aloud in the dreamy cells, call to each other, even anticipates what Adorno calls the dream chaos of surrealism. By refusing he goes on, by refusing the desideratum of realism, these texts stand in a relation of tension to the symbol. That's Adorno. In a related essay, Duckman, the critic Duckman, argues that the past is an apparition which has an illuminating effect the moment that it appears. So it comes about that the appearance of the past is the ground of meaning. What appears in such visions, as with the mermaids here, is what Duckman calls non-being. It's the other, the apparition as other. To the viewer or the poet, the apparition surprises. So when we meet the sea creatures, we meet what Duckman calls a world without world, before the world. So the mermaid perhaps embodies or disembodies nature. She's transformed to become the nature of a work of art as an image. In other words, in these poetic texts, art is the trace of the apparition. The apparition exists as a trace, which is constantly, about to vanish. Under such a template, art promises happiness, but it's a promise which is, as with the mermaid, related to finitude, disappearance, and separation. Isabel Armstrong notes, interestingly, that Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology and these mer poems are published in the same year, 1830. And she also observes how the mermaid has a slippery latecomers to the world of legend. The Victorians, therefore, in this reading are latecomers. As we've seen in the 12th book of the Odyssey, Homer depicts a primal scene of musical overpowering and resistance to it with the songs of the sirens. Odysseus, on his seaward journey home, gets a warning from Circe to beware of the siren's song. He tells the men that he alone will hear the song and orders him orders them to tie him to the ship's mast, as the song brings death to its listener. As Peter Sloterdijk remarks, death at the hand of the sirens comes not in a horrific way, but as an irresistibly flattering melody. The song, as Sloterdijk goes on, feigns to the hero that his wish has been fulfilled. The siren song is seductively harmonious and shrill.
Roger, I think you may have frozen up again.
Both parties appear to survive. It's possible to construe the mermaid phenomenon, then, as an object of art. The image of the imaginary sea creatures, I try to suggest here, functions as a picture of a world unrealized, or as a utopian projection rather than an actualization. An encounter with a sea creature affirms a different world, that is, the realm of poetry. Called a pre-modern world of magical causality, divorced from the incoming Victorian era. We're in 1830. Art, therefore, serves as a kind of creative deterritorialization. It performs an aesthetic function. And another critic writes, such art produces a line of flight from within constituted territories. It produces new modes of becoming. Served to frame what Barbara Johnson, referring to Mallarmé, describes as a statement of preference for the imaginary over the real. And she goes on, for the idealized aesthetic image of femininity over the banality of ordinary sexual intercourse. These Tennysonian texts, therefore, conform to the way in which, as she sees in Mallarmé, the literary maneuver involves rhetorical displacement or circumvention of literal sexuality. In a Mallarmé poem, which I haven't got on the text on the slides, but in a Mallarmé poem, Le Nénuphar Blanc, she shows how it's the lady's belt that serves to divide her in two. The head or visage is the worldly conscious self. The part below the belt is the charme instinctique en dessous, the instinctive charm below. In the Tennyson texts, it's precisely the part below the belt, the fishy tail, which embodies the impossibility of the promised sexual fulfillment. The mermaid's role is thus that of what has been called a virtually undefeated seductress, who never completes her sexual act. Linda Ostern points out, even the siren's nutritive breasts, maidenly face, cannot conceal her barren coldness or sexual inaccessibility. If we could go to the slide 7. These hidden attractions, crucial to the imaginary figure of the mermaid, were recently explored in a poem by Rilke, which he wrote in 1907 during a visit to Capri, called The Island of Sirens. I'll just read this bit. The sailors become aware of singing, then blindly lean into their oars, ringed around seemingly by tranquil stillness filled, with the expanses and close fanned against the ears, as though its obverse side were that song that no one can resist. And then if we go to next slide, slide 8. The resonance of Tennyson's mermaid poems and other mid-Victorian mermaid poems that I've bypassed would persist predictably within subsequent English movements, particularly perhaps the Georgians, as in next slide, Walter de la Mare's The Mermaids, which I'll just read the last bit of. Blow, I think you perhaps, not sure you've got all of that. Blow, blow, winding shells, and the watery fish, deaf to the hidden bells, in the water splash. No streaming gold, no eyes, watching along the waves, but far-blown shells, faint bells from the darkling caves. A more, next slide, please. A more unlikely echo of the mermaid texts can also be detected in a key poem of the modernist movement, written by one of Tennyson's most stringent critics. The river's tent is broken. The last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. The wind crosses the brown land unheard. The nymphs are departed. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. The river bears no empty bottles, sandwich papers, or other testimony of summer nights. The nymphs are departed. And if we could just go to number 10 now. Well, thanks. I'm just finishing now. This painting is by Frederick Leighton, The Fisherman and the Siren, late 1850s. And then could we go to the next one, number 11? Thanks. This one is by Swiss artist Berkelin, Calm Sea. Slightly alarming painting, I think. To sum up, in his mermaid poems and other texts of the early 1830s, Tennyson explores and develops the lyric tradition inherited from the Romantics, notably, of course, Keats, Shelley, and Coleridge. Elizabeth Helsinger suggests that poetry under the aegis of song, as Hallam noted in the lyric verse of Keats and Shelley and Tennyson, is poetry that dabbles in magic. Hallam, in his famous essay, argued, as Elizabeth notes, that Tennyson thinks through sound to create a wholly verbal music. And she also argues, for Hallam, thus it is that at this crucial literary juncture of the 1830s, with the early demise of all the leading Romantic poets, even with Clare in the Asylum, the mermaid song at sea, at the sea margins, comes to mysteriously and hypnotically embody the allure of the newly minted but vanishing lyric verse. As I see it, it's very alluring, but it's giving way to Victorian realism, if you put it that way. The fleeting and hallucinatory nature of the sea creatures, the merman and the mermaid, register what Simona Becconi, referring to Hardy, classifies as the passage from optical phenomena in physical space to a series. The mermaid, and I'm finishing now, the mermaid epitomizes, therefore, for readers of the 1830s, a symbolic, what we might call a symbolic demundanization of the ordinary, which is transformed into a culturally sacred entity, which resonates against the oncoming force of Victorian realism, perhaps. With the expiry of the Romantic movement, these images now begin to blur or appear as defocused. And if we could just go to the final image. Here we are. Yes, I'll say something in a minute. The mermaid poems, therefore, from the early days of Tennyson's, the very early days of Tennyson's career, enact what we could call a transition from the status of being aesthetically salient to a kind of aesthetic desacralization. They image almost a farewell of Victorian poetry in a move towards a literature of social, personal crisis and change. And I really finished, but then the final image is an interesting surrealist one by Magritte in 1934, which, as we see, reverses the figure of the mermaid. She becomes a fish at the top and female below the waist. And his title for this has the very strange title, Collective Inventions. Anyway, that's my talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Roger. And it is time for us to pepper Roger with some questions. So if you'd like to raise your hand, you can either do it physically